The cornerstone of philosophy is rational thought. But when you think about rational thought, that is actually a rather difficult concept to really grab a hold of. And the reason why is because there are so many different definitions of what is rational versus what is irrational. This section wants to talk about what we are talking about in the philosophical world when we use this word rationality. Just to throw out an example, if I were all of a sudden, in the context of this lecture, just to start talking about how philosophy is so fun and enjoyable and really important, all of which I do believe, and then you said, well, why do you think that? And I said, well, I think that because my grandma had purple carpeting when I was growing up. Duh! Well, obviously you would say, that's a little loony. This teacher probably should be doing something else other than teaching. I've had some teachers like that, and I have thought that about them. Anyways, why? Why would what I just said be considered so irrational? Well, you could probably throw out a lot of different responses to that. You could say it's irrational because there is no causal connection between my grandma's carpeting when I was growing up and the discipline of philosophy. You could consider that irrational because these two different areas really don't have any rational connection to each other. Not just causally, but even in terms of what they mean and what they're all about. If I said that my grandma had purple carpeting when I was growing up, and she did in her dining room, it was horrid. If I said that, well, you could make a rational claim that might say, therefore my grandma didn't have really good taste, or any number of different conclusions that you can draw from that. But the one conclusion you cannot draw from that is that, therefore, philosophy is a worthwhile discipline to study. So, right from the outset, we recognize that there are claims that we consider rational and claims that we consider irrational. Philosophy is all about trying to make these rational claims. Please notice the definitions for philosophy that Gary Kessler provides in the textbook. He provides several, actually. Philosophy is love of wisdom versus love of, stupidity, a lack of wisdom. He says that philosophy is the unusually stubborn attempt to think clearly. So, to think in such a way that our rational powers are able to arrive at claims that make sense, that are coherent, that are persuasive. This is what philosophy is all about. And thinking clearly versus thinking in a way that maybe you might say is kind of fuzzy, thinking clearly is what the world of philosophy is all about, and it's unusually stubborn in its attempt to do so. The other definition that Gary Kessler gives is he says that philosophy has to do with formulating questions. And so formulating questions is a really important part of exercising our rational powers. When talking about rationality, Gary Kessler also presents two different options, if you will, two different ways of viewing rationality. He refers to these as Foundationalism versus Constructivism, two essentially competing schools of thought about what we mean when we say that people are rational beings. Let's start with Foundationalism. Foundationalism has to do with the idea that all ideas of truth exist in an objective way. We can come to discover them. If we are truly being rational, we will arrive at a recognition of these universal and objective truths. In other words, we do not make these up. These are not merely a matter of our perception or perspective. These are truths that you and I, when we're really being smart, we're really using our brains well, we can come to realize. Now notice on the slide that you have here for this podcast that the second bullet point under foundationalism also says if an infinite regress of reasons is to be avoided, there must be some foundation of self-evident beliefs. Now, what that means, and that language might be a little bit confusing, infinite regress, but the idea is that at the end of the day, every single claim that we make can be traced back to some foundation, some self-evident belief. The example that I will use for this comes from the religious world. In the religious world, it is so helpful sometimes to be able to make claims because you are able to make claims based very frequently on what is considered divine revelation. So you go back to a foundation, you go back to perhaps what might even be considered a self-evident belief, and then all of your claims basically sprout from that. There's very little room for dispute, actually, among many people, of a religious temperament. So, really clear example of that might be that it is wrong to engage in premarital sex. Okay, that's a belief that's held by many mainstream religions today. Now, if you were to ask somebody, well, why is it wrong? Why do you make that value judgment? You say, this is the truth, that it is wrong to engage in premarital sex. What a person in the theological and religious world would say is, well, because God ordained it so. Because if we look at different passages in the New Testament, and if we look at church traditions that we believe are guided by God, it has been revealed to us that this is wrong. We don't really need to go that much further. We don't need to say, well, but what about in this instance or whatever, because there is this foundation. So foundationalism, sometimes in its extreme form, could even amount to a kind of what we might refer to as a fundamentalism. The idea that, there is one answer, and that answer can be traced back to its objective root. Now let's take a look at the next kind of school of thought known as Constructivism. Constructivism wants to make pretty much just the opposite claim as the Foundationalists. Constructivists will say that there are many rationalities, and they're based on what we refer to as intersubjective agreement, as you'll see from that slide there. Well, what that basically means is that your experience, where you come from, your cultural background, the language that you speak, your individual history, all of these factors affect the way you think. Consequently, the way you think is going to be different than the way I think, than the way somebody who lives in Poland thinks, and you can go on and on. You'll notice the second bullet point. It says that there is cultural, historical, anthropological, and linguistic evidence to support this claim. That when you look at different cultures throughout time, you can see that people have held on to very, very different views about what is true, about what is good, about what is meaningful, beautiful, all of these things. So the bottom line is, somebody might say, well, okay, there is no real basis, that is, there is no objective basis for making our claims. Everything ultimately becomes a matter of our agreeing to a particular claim. Constructivism often amounts to a kind of relativism, where all values become relative to the people who are holding on to those values. So, in its, I suppose, least dangerous form, it might be that I believe dandelions are beautiful, you think dandelions are ugly, neither one of us is right, neither one of us is wrong, it's just a matter of our own personal notion, our own personal rational conclusion, more or less. The problem is when you get into more serious concerns. So when you start getting into ethical concerns, such as the abortion debate is a perfect example, where people are saying it is wrong to terminate a pregnancy, during such and such a time of a woman's term, and then other people say no, it is completely ethically possible. Well, the constructivists, somebody who's way, way over on the constructivist end, will say, well, there's neither right nor wrong. It's ultimately what you decide to be. The foundationalist, of course, will make a more absolute claim and say, no, wrong is wrong regardless. It has an objective foundation that can be traced back to, certain core principles that all of us, if we were really thinking clearly, we would all agree to. So these are the big differences between foundationalists and constructivists, and what I'm going to ask for you to do in the very next discussion is essentially to identify your own leanings. Are you foundationalist? Are you constructivist? Are you a little bit of both? What are the criteria or the areas in which you tend to be more foundationalist or more constructivist? Have fun!